Hello, I am Rachel. I am a campaigner with Tilt. Tilt is the digital campaigning organization of the European Green Party. I am joined with some lovely experts here. We have Vera Coelho. Vera Coelho is the Oceana's Senior Director Advocacy in Europe. She leads the organization's campaigns and Oceana's policy, communications, and science work in Europe. Vera is a political scientist with 14 years of experience working with national, European, and global environment NGOs to protect freshwater and saltwater ecosystems. She's intimately familiar with EU decision-making processes and what it takes to successfully implement EU campaigns to achieve measurable conservation impact. We are also joined by Bjorn Stockhausen, who is the advisor on fisheries policy for the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament. And prior to that, he worked for the NGO at Seas at Risk in Brussels and the European Commission's Joint Research Center in Ispra, Italy, and he studied biology and marine ecology in Germany and Finland. So we're really grateful to have you both here. Thank you for joining us for this discussion on oceans. As we address the climate crisis, we can't forget the fact that we are also in the midst of an extinction crisis that will have catastrophic effects on the climate, but also on biodiversity. And bottom trawl fishing specifically is an example of a practice that is both threatening our climate safety goals as well as killing precious sea creatures. A 2019 UN report found that there are 1 million species under threat of extinction, many of them within decades. And you know, the oceans are a place that are absolutely going to be devastated if we don't take the action necessary. And we're continuing to see that overfishing and destructive overfishing practices of our oceans are rampant and devastating. And sustainable fishing is not just crucial for climate and biodiversity, but it's also crucial for the economies of local fishers. And so I think we need to as Greens, be thinking through, of course, we believe in the science, but the science has always been there. And science has always been there to follow, and we of course always want to follow the science, but also how are we making these actions actually come to life, and how are we thinking through our relationship with fishers, and then we're not pitting science against, you know, local fishers, and how are we advancing the science, what science tells us to do. So without further ado, I am going to pitch to Bjorn to present to us.
Thank you very much. You can hear me well? Great, thank you. Thank you, Rachel, for the lovely introduction. I'm very happy. Thank you for inviting me to discuss with you and present you a bit the overview why oceans are important for humankind and why and of course for the planet. I will give you some examples how we are treating the ocean and what the EU is doing to protect it. And then Vera will go into detail on further topics of protected areas and bottom trawling. So let's start. Well, why should we protect the oceans? First, of course, there is biodiversity. An estimated 10 million species live in the oceans, and every research trip brings back more marvelous creatures. So there's much more to see, much more to discover. Reefs and other diverse habitats provide nursery areas. So larvae and young fish, for example, can grow up, mature, and reproduce eventually again. And let's not forget, the marine phytoplankton produces around 50% of the global oxygen, the very oxygen that we are breathing. So many reasons to protect it. But there's more. Climate change, mitigation, adaptation. Around 25% of the human-emitted emitted carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans. This comes at a cost though. Ocean surface acidity has increased by 30%, and this is making it more difficult for shell-forming creatures to actually build their shells, to build them up. Further, oxygen is decreasing in the upper layers, also creating an environment which is not anymore perfect for those animals living there and species. Then, while we are approaching the 1.5 degree global increase, not sure we are making it to stay below, but more than 90% of the excess heat in the climate system has been absorbed by the oceans. This also came at a cost, or is still happening actually, because species are reacting to this and they are moving polewards. So the distribution is going away from the tropical and temperate regions towards the pole, and eventually this has an impact also on food security in regions for humans. Further, there's coastal protection. Mangroves and reefs provide natural defenses against storm surges and hurricanes. So if we destroy them, if we cut them down, the storms can hit our coasts, and with increasing extreme weather events, we should actually protect these natural defenses. Yes, we are exploiting the oceans, and we should be doing it in a more economic way, in a more sustainable way. So let's look at the facts nevertheless. So humans are extracting about 100 million tons of fish every year, of which around 80 million come from aquaculture. While it's not that important, it's still a beloved dish, of course, but in some regions of the world, it's very important actually. So there are more than 3 billion people on this planet that depend by 20% of the protein intake per capita from the oceans, from the fish they're catching. And some countries, such as Indonesia, Bangladesh, Ghana, but more, are actually depending to 50% on the fish they're catching. Then we have marine genetic resources. Imagine like extreme conditions in the deep sea, no light, a lot of pressure, very deep, and there are hydrothermal vents with hundreds of degrees of hot water coming out of the ocean floor. And they offer these animals, these species, creatures, bacteria living there, they offer unique biological traits. And we can take samples, and have done so in the past, and extract the enzymes, and then, for example, design new medicines. If we destroy these hydrothermal vents before, also the resource is gone. And yes, tourism, people go to the sea to relax. You and I, we go to the seaside, enjoy the sunset, go to the water, we enjoy nature. We should do it in a non-invasive way, but nevertheless, it is an important factor. And of course, let's not forget, why not? Why should we not protect the ocean? It has an intrinsic value. It's beautiful. It's our natural heritage. It just is and should be protected. Now let's have a look at how we are actually treating the oceans. Yes, we are treating it not very well, unfortunately. So there are more and more larger oxygen-free or depleted dead zones around our coasts. And this happens because there are fertilizer runoffs from the coast through the rivers into the oceans. And these oxygen-free zones become biological deserts. Nothing can live there. Then we have plastic pollution. Over the years, the campaigns have contributed to the knowledge, of course. So just for the statement that as still we know, there are at least 8 billion tons of plastic end up in our oceans every year, mostly from land-based sources. And noise, maybe a topic that has not reached the public audience so far yet. Noise in the oceans has a detrimental effect, very negative effect. It's coming from seismic surveys, for example, for oil deposits, pile driving, from dredging, naval exercises, shipping, and it impacts mostly marine mammals. It leads to disorientation, to injury, and can lead to death. Then let's look a bit at the fisheries part of the impacts. Overfishing is taking place. Stocks fished at biologically unsustainable levels have increased from 10% in the 70s to nowadays more than 1/3 of all stocks. We are altering, we are changing the marine environment through all our activities. And there, fishing, as international scientific reports have shown, has the largest relative impact. Linked to this altering of the marine environment, we have lost 10% of seagrass meadows every decade from the 70s on. And seagrass meadows are carbon sinks. So we are undermining the ocean's ability to help us. Further, 1/3 of reef-forming corals, sharks, and marine mammals are threatened with extinction. So what has happened in the past is that 50% of live coral cover of reefs has been lost since the 1870s. And these are the reefs, these are the natural habitats that the larvae, the juvenile species need to grow up. Taking all this together, what has happened? We are seeing the effects now. We are losing the foundations of all ocean life. A projected decrease of 10% in ocean net primary production is happening due to climate change alone by the end of the century. And this is the undermining, the very foundation of all ocean life out there. Resulting from this, we are losing protein sources. So depending on which climate trajectory we will be ending up with, end of the century, we're losing between 3 and 25% of fish biomass by then. And then consider this in relation with the countries mentioned earlier that are dependent on fish as a protein source. And we are losing natural protective structures. And this in a time, as I said, in the times of increasing and stronger extreme weather events. So these were a lot of dire messages, and some things, of course, are being done to improve this. Let's have a look at a selection of the most important legislations at EU level that are out there, since many years, that are protecting the oceans. So almost 30 years ago, we had the Habitats Directive, and I'm focusing on very small part of what these regulations and directives are doing. So the Habitats Directive from 1992 aims at the protection and conservation of natural habitats and of animal and plant species. It's doing this both for terrestrial and for the marine environment, but of course, for most of interest today for us is the marine environment. Then we have the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, MSFD. It aims at achieving good environmental status of all EU marine waters. And it's very big, it's very comprising, it includes everything. There are 11 descriptors in there that, amongst others, protect biodiversity and food webs, reduce overfishing, limit contaminants, reduce marine litter, and much more. So if these were achieved, EU marine waters would be a paradise for both humans and for animals. Then we have the Common Fisheries Policy from 2013. And in the last reform, amongst others, was adopted to agree on a sustainable exploitation of fisheries. There's much more, but let's focus on this one. Then we have the deep sea regulation. Why do we need this special regulation only for the deep sea? Because in the deep sea there is no light, there are much less nutrients, and everything grows slower. So when we destroy something, it takes much longer to restore, to recover it. And then we have the technical measures regulation, the latest one. This one aims to reduce the impact by fishing activities on sensitive species and on fish stocks. So it looks like we have quite a good selection and we are on a good track. Yes and no. Because yes, there are legislation is out there, they were adopted, but the problem, maybe in your policy field you have experiences as well, it's always the problem is implementation. So we look at the legislative goals and actually requirements, binding requirements that were there to be achieved. And we have in the Common Fisheries Policy and the MSFD, they were supposed to achieve their objectives by 2020, and they did not achieve them. So we still don't have a good environmental status. We still don't have sustainable exploitation of all stocks as required, and we have still many unwanted catches of sensitive species and of other fish. Why is this happening? There is a resistance of actors and of administrations against certain paradigm shifts. If a new regulation comes into place, it looks overly ambitious, it means changing, and even with taxpayer subsidies that are often or almost always provided, it's difficult to change people's perception and change their daily behavior. So these EU rules were adopted, but then it depends on the Commission to enforce them towards the member states, to look, are they actually doing it? And on the member state, it depends to enforce them towards, for example, their fishing fleets or other economic sectors that also would have to follow them. Another issue is that there's insufficient monitoring, control, and enforcement. So we need to know actually what is going on at sea and to reward those that follow the rules and penalize those that do not. And the current capabilities are clearly not enough to fulfill these needs. And whenever there's an investigation actually looking at a certain aspect and there's a study being done, it shows there was a control gap and the things are not going as they should be according to the regulation. So these were a lot of dire messages, and you will for sure hear from other stakeholders that the situation is improving in some areas and for some species, which is correct. So that's why I put this small disclaimer here. But for sure, it is not as much improving as legally required. And for very sure, it's not as much improving or being maintained in a good way as needed from an environmental point of view and from a scientific point of view. So taking a look at biodiversity, there is especially not going well, as many reports have shown. So there are many negative impacts on the oceans, on the biodiversity, which is under threat, which is also confirmed by international studies at UN level. And now it's 2021, and we have something to do because we want to protect biodiversity. There have been crises have been mentioned. There's the climate crisis, but there's also the biodiversity crisis. So what has happened? The Commission came up last year, now it's 1 year ago, with the biodiversity strategy. It's only a strategy, so we're still waiting for the respective, at least for the marine areas, for the respective legislative proposals. And this biodiversity strategy contains many necessary objectives and good ideas. And it serves also showing that the EU is willing to support the goals of the upcoming biodiversity COP in autumn in China. Let's hope it can take place, because their new goals on international levels are supposed to be agreed to. And the biodiversity is huge. Again, it focuses on terrestrial and marine topics. But today we focus on the one of the objectives that can help to tackle many of the impacts described in the last minutes, such as biodiversity protection, habitat restoration, reduction of overfishing, improving CO2 sequestration. And in the proposal, now on this point, it states, let's protect 30% of EU waters. And 1/3 of that area should be strictly protected, so 10%. And if you think about, sounds good, yes, let's do it. The devil is in the detail, because now the political battle begins on actually what does protected mean? Which activities should be allowed and which not? And which activities are the most destructive ones? And with this, I hand over to Vera. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Vera.
Yeah, thank you, Björn. That was a great introduction. Let's see if I managed to share my screen. Can you see my presentation? Yeah, okay, good. All right, thank you and good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to join you here today. So after that great introduction from Björn, I thought I'd talk to you today about a very specific threat to marine life in Europe, which is destructive fishing, and in particular, a fishing method called bottom trawling. This fishing method is highly destructive, widely used, and rather prevalent in Europe. And it's allowed pretty much everywhere, including in our protected areas. I'll tell you more about it, but just last week we released a video that tells the story in a rather succinct way, so I thought that maybe we could start there. So let's see if this works.
Our ocean and the life it harbours is essential to us all. The ocean is a source of oxygen and food, of beauty and inspiration, and it also plays a key role in regulating our climate. Marine protected areas are our at-sea heritage and the jewels in the crown of our ocean. They are reservoirs of life and essential to rebuild our ocean's abundance. But not if bottom trawling takes place in them. Like a bulldozer, bottom trawling destroys indiscriminately everything in its path, including fragile and long-lived habitats like coral, reefs and sponges, as well as the animals that depend on them. Bottom trawling is highly unselective. Up to half of the catch is often discarded back into the sea, dead or dying. As well as scarring the seafloor, the heavy trawl gear causes a release of huge amounts of carbon into the ocean, reducing resilience to climate change. So why is this destructive type of fishing allowed in our supposedly protected areas? Bottom trawling has no place in Europe's marine protected areas. Sign our petition and help us protect the crown jewels of our ocean.
Right, so as you will have noticed by now, I work for Oceana, and Oceana is the largest international organization dedicated exclusively to the protection of the ocean. And one of the many things that makes Oceana special is that we actually go out to sea and we conduct research expeditions, either with our own vessel, the Ranger, that you can see in the picture, or with other vessels, and we document the absolutely amazing marine life that we have in Europe. And sometimes when I show some of these pictures, people think that they are actually from some exotic, tropical, remote location from some other Oceana office. But in fact, the seas around Europe are full of wonderful life. We have documented coral gardens, gorgonians, sponges, caves, deep sea reefs, and the incredible species that live in them, from tiny nudibranchs to huge whales, sharks, turtles, seals, you name it. Europe is full of underwater treasures that most of us don't even know or realize about. Now, the good news is that scientists and governments do know about it, and the EU has several laws that require that these precious species and habitats are actually protected, as well as several laws to regulate fishing and other activities that can have an impact on these species and habitats, as Björn mentioned. And not only are they protected because they are beautiful or inspiring or important for biodiversity or because of their intrinsic value, many of these habitats and species have been recognized for protection because we know, as Björn also mentioned, that a healthy marine ecosystem is essential for the ocean to be able to provide all those things that are also economically and socially important, such as sustaining fish populations for fisheries or enabling tourism or other economic activities. So that was the good news. The knowledge is there, the legislation exists to protect our marine treasures. And this legislation has led to many areas in Europe's seas being designated as marine protected areas. The EU announced already a couple of years ago that it has met its Aichi target of protecting 10% of its marine area, and it's currently moving towards this target of 30% that the European Commission also put in its biodiversity strategy. Currently, we are at around 11 to 12% of protected areas around Europe. And also, as you can see from the map, different countries are at different stages of progress towards meeting that 30% objective. Now, the bad news is that this legislation, despite existing for a long time, is having a hard time coming out of the paper and actually having an impact on the water. The font in this slide is probably a bit too small for you to be able to read it, but just 6 months ago, the European Court of Auditors published a damning report highlighting that despite the entire body of EU law aimed at protecting the marine environment, the court found, and I quote, that EU action has not led to the recovery of significant marine ecosystems and habitats, and that its framework to protect the marine environment is not deep enough to restore seas to good environmental condition, while EU funds rarely support the conservation of species and habitats. The auditors found that marine protected areas provide limited real protection, while overfishing persists, particularly in the Mediterranean. And unfortunately, the Court of Auditors is absolutely right. Last year, Oceana conducted an analysis of the management of all Natura 2000 marine sites in Europe, and the results were really shocking. We found that of the 500,000 square kilometers designated as Natura 2000 sites at sea, only 380 square kilometers, and I mean 380, not 380,000, right? Really just 380 square kilometers were actually free of any threats, such as fishing or oil and gas exploration or shipping or submarine cables or other threats. And when we looked at the sites that were designated specifically to protect seabed habitats, we found that destructive fishing was allowed in 86% of the area of those MPAs. So our conclusion is that while countries are making all these lofty statements that they want to protect 30% of the ocean, in fact, they are simply drawing lines on a map, and these are just paper parks. And the area that is really protected is less than 1%. And one striking example of this lack of protection is indeed bottom trawling. Now, this is a fishing method whereby a heavy trawl net is dragged across the seafloor, usually weighed down by chains. And this is done to capture fish that live near or on or near the bottom of the sea. And this is a very efficient way of fishing because the net catches everything in its path. It's also highly destructive and unselective, as we've seen in the video. Bottom trawling just destroys or removes completely these structures in the bottom of the sea that provide shelter or nursery areas for fish and other marine species. And not only does it remove and therefore reduce the animals and the species in these locations, but it also changes the balance between species because those that are more sensitive or more long-lived disappear and are replaced by sturdier, more resilient species that are more adapted to this constant disturbance of their environment. Also, the resuspended sediment from the trawl sweep disrupts the biochemical processes in the ocean and also has an impact on eutrophication. Just recently, a couple of months ago, a paper came out in Nature that indicates that globally, bottom trawling also has a huge impact on the climate. We already know for many years that this is a hugely fuel-intensive fishing method, and it only subsists actually thanks to lots of direct and indirect fuel subsidies. But now this paper also showed that it mobilizes carbon from the seabed, and globally speaking, it releases more carbon into the water column than the entire aviation sector releases into the atmosphere. One important thing also to keep in mind when thinking about these impacts is the post-impact recovery period, right? So after a trawl sweep, can the ecosystem recover? And studies indicate that the recovery time is fairly long. It obviously depends on the type of ecosystem and the intensity of the impact, but studies indicate that it takes between 2 to 15 years to recover from trawling. Also, if you think of really fragile ecosystems, Björn mentioned the deep sea in his presentation. So if you have a deep sea coral that takes centuries to grow, and that is destroyed by bottom trawling, then the recovery period is again centuries, or possibly it never comes back. So the recovery after the trawling is really a problematic issue. And recovery is also difficult because the impacts are repeated and continuous. And particularly in Europe, bottom trawling is highly prevalent. Studies show that Europe is much more bottom trawled compared to other regions of the world, and that more than 50% of the entire continental shelf of the EU is regularly impacted by bottom trawling. And this is compared to a global average of 14%. So 14% is the global average, but even if you look at other leading fishing regions in the world, so that it's a bit more comparable. So if you look at Alaska or Australia or New Zealand, these are also very productive fishing nations, but they have significantly less trawling, and it's less than 10% of their seabed that is impacted, compared to, again, more than 50% for Europe. And also some of Europe's seas are among the most trawled in the world. The Adriatic Sea, the Skagerrak, the Kattegat, the Irish Sea, the Western Baltic, all of them have between 75 and 100% of their seabed regularly impacted by bottom trawling. And this widespread bottom trawling is also happening even inside our protected areas. And in fact, the study indicates that trawling intensity is sometimes even higher inside the protected areas than outside. And I think, personally, what is even worse about this situation is that all of this destruction is really not necessary. If you think in terms of overall catches from the bottom trawling fleet, 80% of the catches come from around 20 to 30% of the bottom trawled area. So we could, if we really wanted to, significantly reduce the trawling footprint in Europe without having a really big impact on overall catches and on the economic viability of the fishing industry. And this is exactly what we think needs to happen. The trawling footprint in Europe should really be drastically reduced. And to do that, we should start with the obvious place, which is protected areas. So if there's one place where this kind of destructive fishing really shouldn't be happening, it's in our protected sites that have been designated because we found that there's important species and habitats there. But in addition to marine protected areas, there's other vulnerable places that should be protected from the damaging impacts of bottom trawling. And I'm thinking, for example, about coastal or inshore areas that are usually also very important as nursery and spawning habitats. And that's where juvenile fishes, for example, seek shelter from bigger predators. And again, the deep sea, because the impacts there are just so difficult to recover from or irreversible. One thing that is important to keep in mind when talking about protected areas is that in Europe, or at least for the Natura 2000 network, areas are designated to protect certain features, right? So if you designate an area to protect a reef, the interpretation of the member states so far is that you just need to protect the reef. So you draw a line on a map, which is very big. You issue a press release. You say, I protected so many square kilometers of my country's ocean. But in fact, the only place where bottom trawling cannot occur is on top of that precise reef. And this causes two problems. First of all, it's very difficult to control, to monitor, and to enforce. So if you allow fishing vessels to enter the marine protected area and say, well, please feel free to bottom trawl everywhere, just not on that reef, who's going to be checking that they are not doing that? So there's a control and enforcement problem. The second problem is also that by trawling all around the feature, it doesn't leave any space for restoration or for expansion of ecosystems. And right now, the EU is pursuing also this restoration agenda. We want to give the ocean the opportunity to restore and to regain some of what was lost. But if we keep trawling right next to these protected features, these seagrasses, these biogenic reefs, etc., they have nowhere to expand into. So there's no place for ecosystem restoration. So that's kind of a more technical detail, but it's important when thinking about the effectiveness of marine protected areas. One other thing that we really think should happen is that MPAs should only count against these international targets of 10%, of 30%, if they are effectively managed, because many of these sites don't even have a management plan to say what is allowed or not allowed, so everything is allowed. And also that certain MPAs are designated under strict protection. So you could imagine that some protected areas could have certain uses, right? Tourism is one that is often mentioned. Whale watching, you know, there's some activities that you could think is compatible with marine protected areas. However, extractive, destructive, industrial activities really don't have a place in what should be strictly protected areas. So in order to achieve this 10% of ambition of having strictly protected areas, an activity like bottom trawling really shouldn't take place. So what can you do? How can you help? The European Commission has committed to publishing by the end of this year an action plan to conserve fisheries resources and protect marine ecosystems. Now, the management of MPAs is mostly a member state competence, but the Commission does have the power to check if the management is adequate and in line with EU legislation, and also to approve fisheries management plans if the MPAs are offshore, so outside of the 12 nautical mile area of each country. In the action plan, therefore, the Commission really should commit to banning bottom trawling inside MPAs and rejecting any member state plans that allow bottom trawling and other destructive fishing inside MPAs. To this end, and as you've seen in the video as well, we've partnered with We Move. I guess many of you probably know this platform. So we have a petition on We Move that is available in different languages. And the aim of the petition is to ask the Commission precisely to adopt this action plan and ban bottom trawling, at least in our protected areas. And I think I leave it there. Thank you.
Great, and I actually have the link to that petition, which I can drop in here. And then we also have a petition, so I'll also drop that one in there as well. Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for your presentations. I feel like there's just so much in there. Yeah, some of the sort of things that pop out is that, yeah, it's quite depressing a little bit, that the state of affairs, and just, yeah, even just things when you say we should not allow destructive practices in strictly protected areas feels like it shouldn't be necessarily a controversial statement. But yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack in all of that. What I'm going to do is there is a few questions. Rihanna's got some hot questions in here. So Rihanna, do you want to maybe just say them out?
Sure. I mean, I guess I have two very different questions already in the chat. So the first one, it's kind of, so this is a topic that's come up quite a bit. Well, actually, my name is Rihanna and I'm the climate campaigner for the EGP. And so one of the things we've been doing is talking a lot with member parties about what some of their sustainability or climate related topics that are most relevant for them. And one is kind of reoccurringly this issue of renewables versus kind of the biodiversity preservation or conservation kind of targets. And of course, there's elements of like NIMBYism and you know, oh, I don't like how windmills look. But you know, maybe taking that aside, I think there are valid arguments to that in terms of how you know, how we do renewables and how we plan them. And so I'm curious about offshore wind and kind of what yeah, how that might play into some of these marine protected areas. Although I acknowledge this may be a bit of a different question than what you've addressed here, but that's where that question came from. And then, yeah, the other question that I had was just kind of whether bottom trawling is even really that necessary to the industry if it's such a destructive method. I mean, I think now, especially with the cap, but also generally, we talk a lot about sustainable agriculture and just the alternative methods that we have, whether that's like precision farming or organic farming, agroecology, whatever it is, and that these are alternatives to the destructive industrial farming practices. And so I wonder, is it sort of similar with the fishing industry as well, where we can say like, this is just a form of fishing that really is not sustainable, no matter how you do it or where you do it, and that we shouldn't, or that it would be better to just find alternatives in general, with sort of the political possibility of that, then of course being again a different question. But yeah, but thanks for your presentations, and yeah.
Thanks, Rihanna. I don't know, Björn, do you want to go first on the offshore wind?
If you want, I can. Yeah. Yes, yes, Rihanna. Very difficult topic, and has been come up also in the legislative discussions already, because we need renewable energy, and wind farms are the most effective ones in producing the most energy per area. So both the Greens, but also the NGOs, they have been stuck between, like, we want biodiversity protection, we want protected areas, but we also need more renewable energy. So what can be done? There can be coexistence. So you could put them into areas and then protect the areas afterwards, not allow anything. And if you put the normal classic ones with the pile driving in there, during the construction phase, you can make a bubble screen around, you can really reduce the impact around it. And once they are there, you close off the area for bottom trawling for sure. And then the areas can act as natural reefs. Artificial reefs. Yes. So it is possible to have this short-term impact, and then for 30 years or however long the park will stay there, it's there. You can also just go for floating wind farms, and then you don't even have an impact on the seafloor. Yeah, so you only have it floating there on the surface. But before this, we have to think, where do we put them? And here marine spatial planning comes into play, because we don't only look at, are there competing economic activities? Are there fishing grounds where people have been going fishing for 200 years? But maybe we should not put an offshore wind park into a bird migratory route. Yeah. So this can all be taken into account. And then we can still put offshore wind farms into areas where they are not disturbing to as low as possible extent the environment and other stakeholders, which are already now protesting since a long time. But maybe Vera want to add on this point?
Yes, I think it's, yeah, you've mentioned many of the things that I would have said, Björn. The key question is really the siting, right? Because with any form of energy provision, there will always be environmental impacts. Those should be assessed, taken into account, and then you need to see, where am I going to put my wind farm? The migratory routes are usually one of the big problems, because maybe it doesn't affect the birds, but it affects other species, or vice versa. So finding the right place to put these windmills or wind farms is really sometimes quite tricky, and it can lead to significant trade-offs, right? But those trade-offs also need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So if you have an impact, on a species that is perhaps more abundant, more common, that is a different story than if you are going to have an impact on a critically endangered species. And we had, lots of conversations recently in the US and Canada, for example, about the siting of offshore wind farms in the migratory route of the North Atlantic right whale, right, where you have less than 400 individuals left. you know, even if renewable energy is very important, and we all agree it is, maybe that's not quite the place to be putting the wind farms. Having said that, wind farms can actually be quite helpful and complementary to marine protected areas because they force the protection of an area. You cannot bottom troll in an area that is full of wind farms because your net just goes against the piles. So it can actually be a good win-win solution if they are properly sited, because then you can mitigate the impacts of the installation and the operation, as Björn was saying, and then during the lifespan of the structure, you may actually prevent some other damaging activities from occurring there. So maybe then if I take your second question about how necessary bottom trawling actually is, that's a tricky one, because if you ask the industry, they will say it's absolutely necessary, right? It's the most common type of fishing in Europe. So it's lots of jobs. It's lots of, you know, of the fishermen that we have in Europe do work on bottom trawlers. So it's a big thing. Is it strictly necessary? Probably not. As I was saying, you can catch the same amount from a smaller area. So you didn't have to have so much bottom trawling everywhere in Europe. There are alternative fishing techniques, of course. The problem is that they are not as efficient at catching fish, right? So if you go for lower impact techniques, they tend to also have lesser yields, or they are more labor intensive. So you need more man hours to take the same amount of fish, so it's less profitable. In the case of bottom trawling, again, the profitability is distorted because it's so subsidized. The fuel is so subsidized. So if fishermen had to pay for the fuel, they might be less interested in bottom trawling as a technique. So there are some options. I don't think that we will realistically get rid of bottom trawling entirely in Europe in the near future because it is so prevalent. So it would really have to be a combination of reducing the footprint and starting the transition towards more low impact fishing methods. One potential pitfall with the lower impact is also that then you can have unintended consequences. And I'm sure Björn knows a lot about this. In the past, there's been attempts at innovation and trying to find other trawling gears that would be less impactful than bottom trawling. And you may have heard, for example, of electric pulse fishing. So instead of having these heavy chains that kind of touch the seabed and make the marine life come up into the net, you would use an electrical impulse to do that. It's now prohibited, but the idea behind that was that the impact would be lower than bottom trawling. But then again, if you look at the impact of bottom trawling, anything has a lower impact. So electric fishing is not necessarily sustainable. Just the fact that it's a little bit better than bottom trawling doesn't make it good. And that is a little bit the danger. That's to try to get rid of something that is hugely destructive. You replace it with something that is a bit destructive, but still not quite good. So I don't know, Björn, if you want to add on that one.
Yeah, if we start talking about pulse fishing now, we could sit here until tomorrow. So let's refrain from that. But thank you for mentioning it. So whatever alternative, as Vera said, exactly we have would be better. And this also has to take into account when it's listening to the counter arguments on restricting the use of bottom trawling. But on one main thing, but also maybe Vera, you can add afterwards on your experience from this. The problem is there. Imagine you have actors that have been using the sea for fishing, for aquaculture, for tourism, for recreational areas, and then they are told, now this area will be protected. This means, oh, I can't go anymore where I have been going for many years. And yes, we have to watch out for small-scale fishers that might be displaced and they have a longer way to reach their other fishing grounds. But there are many examples, I think Oceana might have done studies on this actually, of where marine protected areas have increased the amount of fish outside of that area. So it's called overspill because of all the factors we were saying before. We have protected habitats in there. We have the juveniles can grow. So the population sometimes have been like twofold, threefold improving. And then these fish have to go somewhere and they go outside of the protected areas and they can be fished because we don't restrict it there. So protected areas have proven to improve the fishing yield outside of protected areas. Maybe you have some examples there, Vera.
Absolutely. There's examples from around the world and including in Europe where this kind of spillover effect has been demonstrated. So marine protected areas can really be, very beneficial to fisheries. And it's actually one of the main drivers sometimes to designate these areas. The question is really the paradigm shift. I think the resistance to marine protected areas often comes from this idea, fishermen traditionally, they would just get on their boat and go wherever they want. And the idea that suddenly there's a limitation and they may not go and fish in the areas where they've done so sometimes for decades or longer is difficult to absorb. But I think there's also really good examples of participatory processes where the fishermen have been involved also in identifying, designating and protecting these areas and being involved also in monitoring, seeing what happens there, because they know each other, they know who goes out at sea, they see each other, and that works really well. But having said that, it's usually a long process to overcome resistance. If you see a public consultation on a new marine protected area, the fisherman input is invariably, no, don't prohibit fishing there because we like to go and fish there.
I see that Rana has her hand up. Is that related in response or? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to take all the space, so others please ask questions, but just two follow-up questions. So firstly then, to sort of disincentivize bottom trawling fishing, and here again from the climate campaigning fossil fuels expert side, I guess, ETS does basically putting a CO2 price on maritime fuels and including those and increasing the price to sort of either phase out the subsidies or directly include them in, for example, the ETS. Would that be one way to maybe disincentivize bottom trawling? And then kind of the second or the other question then, when there's so much of the sort of fishing community that pushes back, I mean, I think again, it's very similar to, like coal communities, or again, with sustainable agriculture that we, some people say that, yes, there are yet less yields from organic agriculture, but we also know that there's a lot of other benefits from it as well. And that it's maybe sort of the same discourse that has to be like, over time through the environmental movement, which I think is in large part very responsible for like shifting sort of attitudes towards, local food, sustainable food, organic food, that it's maybe similar in that sense.
Yeah, and actually just to sort of jump off of that, I sort of have a question related to that as well that maybe you can speak to with this answer. Like sort of, yeah, thinking through the like process of like getting progress on this. Like, I think like, for instance, in a Canadian context, there's been a lot of success in like campaigning on stopping the logging of old growth trees, because I think it taps into this narrative of like fear of loss. And I think, with these like 100-year-old like reefs and corals, I think there is such a potential to like have like narrative power with this, because I think if you ask the average person if they would like dolphins and sea turtles and like 100-year-old corals to die, they would say no, and they would absolutely, feel impassioned about that. So is there sort of like, can you see sort of the path forward through the like lobbyists and like, like getting the like sort of popular support needed to push this forward? And in that sense, do you have sort of advice to green parties across Europe if like they could, like if do you have reflections on how they can sort of tap into that and push that forward?
You want me to go first, Björn? All right. Yeah, lots to unpack there. I think on the question of ETS specifically, I don't know enough about the subject to say something, you know, useful about it. I do think that making the, you know, the operators pay at least the full price of the fuel would go a long way to reduce bottom trawling, because it's the single biggest operating cost of a bottom trawler is just the fuel cost. It's more than the salaries, it's more than anything else. So the fact that they don't pay tax on it, and in certain countries they even have a direct fuel subsidy, goes a long way to make it, you know, profitable for them to operate such a fuel intensive fishing gear. So that's really an area where the EU has not done well. The fishing fuel is tax exempt under an EU taxation directive. So all member states are obliged to exempt their fishing fuel from taxes. And the only way to change that is through unanimity to this day, because it's taxation. So that's really a tough nut to crack. And worst of all, because of this, the EU is defending a position at the WTO negotiations on fishery subsidies, where they want the WTO to accept fuel subsidies globally. So we're taking our bad practice to tell China and others, please feel free to subsidize your fuel as well. So that's really one of my pet hates, as Björn very well knows. So then in terms of the just transition, I think it's spot on. It's really what we need to start thinking about is how do we transition all these sectors? So not only the coal sector, but indeed the destructive fishing sector and others. How do we help these people to retrain and to find other options that allow them to continue having a livelihood, doing something that often they love, right? Going out at sea and fishing, something that is often one of the few job opportunities. So if you think of the more remote regions, even in Europe, I'm Portuguese, you know, in the Azores, you don't have that many job opportunities. So you're either a fisherman or there's not that much else to do. So it's important to think, okay, if I tell this person, you cannot bottom trawl anymore, how do I help this person to earn a living in a different way, and in a way that is also that makes sense to them and to the region where they live? So, and that is an area where we really want to learn also from all these just transition movements. And in fact, we are just organizing the NGOs an Ocean Week on the 2nd week of June. So, and on World Ocean Day, we have a high-level event where we invited someone from the International Trade Union Confederation to share with us indeed lessons from, you know, the just transition in the coal and other sectors, so that we can learn from that for the fishing sector. Björn, I don't know if you want to add.
Oh, nothing much left, but actually just to emphasize again what you started, you said everything on the energy taxation directive. So it's not known. It's something like now it has become known with the kerosene for airlines, but this is like what Vera said. It's ridiculous. How can such a fuel intensive sector be exempted from the tax? Yeah. So, and the reform is going on now. So if you want to combine maybe now climate campaigns and ocean protection campaigns, the energy taxation directive would be a good lever at the moment. And then everybody, NGOs and we are of course are available for providing input on this. And yes, also on the different jobs, Vera said it, people that do this, they might have been doing it for generations. They love to be out there at sea in the elements. They bring home food, direct, real food to their coastal communities. Often when we are discussing with stakeholders from the sector, they speak about the passion, the tradition, the culture, and this has also found its way into legislative amendments where this is being emphasized. So we need to take them into account and give them something where they can continue to be linked with their environment. There is so much love, doing it in a more environmentally friendly manner. And yes.
Great. Yeah, I think these are just like some important questions to be continuing to discuss. I see that Marie has a question. Marie, with the beautiful background, would you like to?
Hi, sorry. I think my laptop's frozen or something like that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's more of maybe controversial, because especially after all you said about fishermen and the love for their craft, but I wonder nowadays, if I like live in Brussels or any big cities in the West, I guess, how difficult is it for me to buy and eat sustainably sourced fish that doesn't come from like mass fishing? And then is there something to be said for people like me who don't depend on fish at all for sustenance, to just cut fish completely out of my diet, and that way, in a way, stop funding practices that I personally don't agree with? I don't know. I don't know what you think about that. Sorry.
Thanks. That's a really interesting question, and it's one that we've been having more recently, also because of Seaspiracy, the Netflix documentary, right? So I think these are really good points. I mean, I personally think it's a tragedy that as consumers and European citizens, we cannot enter a shop and be sure that whatever is being sold there in terms of fish is legal to start with, and sustainable. So it's really a failure of policy and legislation that we cannot be assured of that it's really difficult to know what fish is being sold, where does it come from, how was it caught, was it legally caught, was there slave labor involved, etc. That's really insane, and we work very hard to change European policy to try to make sure that that happens. And that, of course, leads some people to say, well, then I don't want to have any part of it and I don't want to eat any fish. And I think that's a completely legitimate personal choice. So nothing absolutely wrong with that. I do think that it's a choice that, unfortunately, a minority of people will make or be able to make. And therefore, we do need to keep pushing on the regulatory side to make sure that those people that continue eating fish and those businesses that continue providing fish do so in a sustainable, legal way that respects human rights and all of that. So that is the dichotomy, right? And even though we may not depend on fish for sustenance in Europe, because we are fortunate enough to have many other options, the fact is also that fish is a globally traded commodity. So the fact that you don't eat fish in Europe or that you don't catch fish in Europe doesn't mean that that fish is not going to get caught elsewhere in the world. So it is important to have sustainable fisheries in Europe, that we have healthy fish stocks, abundant fish stocks that can feed lots of Europeans, because if we crash our stocks, again, we have the money to buy it from elsewhere, and sometimes it doesn't come from such well-managed locations or places where also human rights are not quite respected.
Yes, I would add to this. So if people are really keen to eat fish, of course, you might prefer certain species, certain types, but you can go for herbivorous fish, no? So fish that like carp, if it's done in extensive aquaculture, it's not consuming anything else. So the point is also then eating in plants and algae, or filtering. The point is, what is your aim? Because do you want to protect the environment? Then of course go for fish, and this has to be on the label how it is caught. Like, is it being caught by passive nets? And where I was going there, how could you replace bottom trawling? Like, it will not be as effective, but some species, maybe not the same, can be caught in a passive way, so there's less fuel consumption. Then you might have the problem of bycatch of other organisms that get stuck in these static nets that are just standing around and being emptied every now and then. But then you have at least one box ticked. So, and this has to be on the label when you buy the fish. How has the fishing gear, how was it caught? Then also what has to be on the label is the fishing area. So when it is known, and there are other NGOs that also provide guides. They say like buy fish species 1, maybe from the North Sea, but don't buy it from the Atlantic or something. Yeah. So it takes a bit of work, it takes a bit of effort, but you can make a informed, not perfectly informed, but consumer decision to some extent. On the labeling, there is it's ongoing. So we have the Common Market Organization, also from 2013. There are some rules in there. But now what is happening, for example, under the farm to fork discussion, which is also going through the co-legislative arena, there also like it's again like it's known that even all politicians say the consumer wants to make an informed decision. And then we see exactly the MEPs, the members in the parliament, everybody say, yes, yes, we want to provide this information. But then when you look at the amendments and you look at the discussions on the actual wording in the end, you see, yeah, but not for these processed seafood products from my regions. No, I don't want to disclose all these details. And then you see this resistance because it's an old discussion, sorry, there was the date of catch was blocked 8 years ago because they knew exactly if people just read on the label, my fish was caught 3 weeks ago somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. Doesn't say anything about quality. It's in ice water, perfect quality, no worries for that. But just the consumer reads it 3 weeks ago, I will not buy this. I might buy the local fish from my fisher on the coast directly, which is from yesterday. Yeah. So all these interests come in at some point. How much information shall be given to the consumers in the end? While ideally, for the consumer, for you to make a perfect decision, purchasing position, as much as information would be desirable.
That's super interesting to hear about. I see here that we have a question from LB. LB, do you want to unmute yourself, or else I can read out the question if not. Not hearing from LB, so maybe I'll just read out the question. It's, in addition to banning bottom trawling within EU waters, what else can the EU do to restrict its use elsewhere? Could SFPAs be a tool?
Should I start? Then, yeah, okay. So SFPAs are fisheries agreements that the EU is doing with countries somewhere in the world. So it has improved, but it means that we are paying other countries, majority West African countries. We give them, let's say, just make up an example. We pay you 50 million euros over the course of 10 years. And for this amount, 20 of our vessels can go and catch X tons of fish. And while this was considered very negative, because in the past it just gave money to the government, you didn't know where it ended up. It might have reduced the food security of the local population, of the small-scale fishers, starting from the beaches there and then catching the fish. So from a Green's perspective, we were very negative in the past. They have improved now, also because from a new regulation that we were responsible for from 2016-17, where it has improved the rules. So now there must be signs saying we are only catching that much, that the local population still has their following their capacity to catch the fish is not being deprived of their food security. Or even better, we only catch species somewhere outside, because what most of these EU fleets are interested in is tuna, and we don't want that much of the local small pelagic species that are being caught closer to the fleet, closer to the coast. So further then, the money has to go to support the development of the local fishing sector. So, and other issues, other improvements. So we have been like sometimes agreeing, sometimes at least not voting against it in the past, but they still need to be improved. And there's always then the control issue. Yeah, it's not only us going there. We do, as the EU now speaking, we do like official contracts signed by the Commission and the government, while there might be other fleets, which is often then the argument also by the EU fishing sector saying, well, look, we are here, we follow the rules, we're doing everything officially, publicly, and then there are China or Russia or Turkey, and they just fish and there's no control and they empty the resource. And then when the EU says we want stricter rules for our EU vessels, and then at some point the sector says, oh, if you squeeze it too much, if you strengthen the rules too much, then the country will just say, we take the 100 million from China without any rules. So it's a thin line to get SFPAs as strict as necessary and still keep them on board.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but SFPAs are indeed a contract, right, between the EU and these other nations, where the EU pays a certain amount for access. And usually this amount is also, at least a part of it is also earmarked, right? So there's also an element of technical assistance from the EU to these countries, or investments in developing their fishing operations, their fishing capacity. So you could envisage a situation where the EU could help these countries to improve their fisheries management, their scientific assessments, and the way that they manage their fleets. However, I think, you know, bottom trawling is perhaps not the biggest issue in these SFPAs, because as Björn was saying, when it comes to the EU vessels that go to fish there, usually these are large pelagic vessels or long liners. So it's not really bottom trawlers. They are targeting mostly tuna or other species. So that's not the fishing method that they use. And then also the local populations often are not using bottom trawlers. They're using pirogues or other smaller vessels, and they're targeting also mostly small pelagic fish. And again, bottom trawling is not the fishing method that they tend to use. Bottom trawling is really for fish like flatfish, like sole, for example, or for demersal fish like cod or hake. So the flatfish lives like in the bottom of the sea, like they dig themselves a little bit into the sand. And then these other fish, they live next to the bottom of the sea. They swim a little bit close to the bottom and feed on animals that live in the bottom. And those are typically these white fish that we like to eat in the West, right? In fillets and all of that. And it's not necessarily the staple food of these countries where we have SFPAs with.
Wow, that's super interesting details in the policy world. Okay, so I think if there's anything, thanks for the question, LB. If there's anything you guys would like to conclude on, any kind of like closing thoughts, go ahead. I can maybe let you reflect on that, maybe at the end. Otherwise, I just want to thank you guys so much for coming to speak to us. Thank you everyone for attending. Again, the petitions that we mentioned before, we are calling for a ban on bottom trawling in protected areas. And Vera mentioned earlier, there's going to be some upcoming excitement related to an Ocean Week and Ocean Day. We are also looking into ways to sort of escalate this campaign. We just sort of kicked it off recently. So stay tuned for those. If you sign up for the petition, you'll get updated. And yeah, I think that's all I've got on that. Any concluding remarks from the experts?
Shall I go first? Okay, so thank you so much for the opportunity. It was really a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I think, I can't remember now if it was you, Rachel, or you, Rihanna, but someone mentioned the need to show the world or to emphasize the impacts that we have in the ocean, the comparison with old growth forests, etc. So that's, I think, one big challenge that we as marine organizations often face, is that all of these impacts are a little bit too abstract or too far away for people to understand what they are, right? So if you like walking in the forest in the weekend, and then you think, oh, these forests are getting logged, that's a very direct relationship. But most of us don't interact with the ocean in that way. We go to the beach and we often don't go much further than that. So any help in kind of remembering the ocean or mentioning the ocean in other policy discussions, I find is always very welcome. We often see that discussions on food security, nutrition, agriculture, they tend to be very terrestrial. Biodiversity, people very quickly think of forests and etc. But often, you know, the ocean is kind of a sphere apart that is not mentioned. So sometimes even in your work, if you're writing a speech, it can just be something as simple as saying marine and terrestrial biodiversity, or saving our forests and our oceans, you know, but just to keep reminding people that 70% of our planet also needs help. And often that doesn't come across in the public discourse. And one other thing that doesn't come across in the public discourse is the role of fishing. Because again, when people think of the ocean, very quickly they think of plastic pollution, again, very visible things that you observe when you go to the beach. The biggest impact on marine biodiversity on the 21st century is still fishing. And it's really important to remind people that this is not a boring topic that nobody cares about, but it's really the biggest impact on marine biodiversity. So you are our allies in this. So if you can help, we really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are some really good points to make. Bjorn, do you have anything?
Not much to add. Thanks also again for bringing up the session and having this under the EGP Council this weekend. So just similar to Vera, it's like it's linked to many policy areas. It's linked to aquaculture. You eat salmon, and salmon has been fed by fish caught before somewhere else in the world. So we are like catching, yes, they're improving, the fish in, fish out ratio is improving, but do we need to eat 1 kilo of fish, which has required before to be fed 3 kilos of fish? So it's like, do we need this? Then it's linked to trade agreements. Like there's a lot of pressure now in the parliament, not only from us, but saying like, do we want trade agreements when their fishing boats have proven slavery on board? Yeah. Then the link now with renewable energy, offshore wind farms, protected areas. So what we often see is that fisheries is seen as silo thinking, which doesn't help the environmental aspect of it. Yeah. So the more we can link it and show it has an impact, and it can also have a positive impact if we get it right, in terms of food security, in terms of protected areas. Like it can have a positive impact, but let's take it a bit, let's open it up. Let's open it up out of often what's happening, silo thinking and silo policy making.
Yes, definitely. That's a really good point. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming. I learned a lot, and I think these discussions are important to dig deep into sort of the nitty-gritty of these things. So thank you all again. I hope you guys can enjoy some blue sky. At least there's some here in Brussels. And have a lovely day. And Petra de Suter's keynote speech is coming up, which you can see on SpotMe or live on our social media channels and YouTube. Petra de Suter, the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
both. It was a super good session. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well,
Thank
take
you.
care.